Hi, I'm Stephen Berkow from InterSystems, and I spend most of my time working with customers and industry groups trying to advance value-based care through interoperability. And I'm joined today by one customer, Karuna Relwani from Blue Cross Blue Shield the Blue Cross Blue Shield Association. And I'm also joined by the head of our field engineers who, among other things, works with the association. And today, we want to spend our time talking about a different aspect of 0057. So you can see it. I know everybody always seems to talk about prior authorization, and we want to talk about the payer-to-payer API provisions within the rule. We want to explore why we think the opportunity they present is really, really powerful and one we can't afford to overlook. We do want to talk about some of the challenges in terms of scaling the utilization of it, and then efforts underway to meet those challenges. So let's get into the opportunity. So it's not a new opportunity. We have a big problem in this country with churn. So I just, if you start on the top left, I just picked out one of statistic that you see. So 20% of people in private plans changing their insurance on an annual basis. And I mean, this is a long time problem we have, and it's such a problem because so much care is dropped within those first 90 days, especially for chronic patients. And wouldn't it be great if when somebody changed plans, the new plan could actually upfront get all the information on their new member so that they could avoid those gaps in care. And you go to the bottom, this is actually a quote from 0057, and the payer-to-payer API was designed to actually enable that. And so for the policy geeks out here, you could be asking, like, well, okay, what's the big difference? There was a rule back in 2020 that basically called for the same thing. So what's different this time around? Why do we think this time around there's a huge opportunity that we can't afford to miss? Well, there's a lot more structure, or to use a technical word, oomph in place to actually enable it this time around. And I've just called out some of them on the right. So first of all, this rule actually provides a standard language, so FHIR. So we actually have a way to speak to each other. We also have PDEX. Now this is recommended. This is a Da Vinci IG. So a way for plans to communicate with each other through those FHIR APIs in a common language. And then dropping down to the bottom, this is really important. So if you're on the IO side of the house and you're talking to your peers on the eligibility side of the house, the fact that there's provisions for bulk FHIR is incredibly important because most of this churn occurs within a very, very limited time, open season. So if it's one-off, it's going to be very, very hard for your care managers to take advantage of this information coming in. They're going to be overwhelmed. So the fact that we could actually have all this information flowing in bulk within that very, very constrained time period, again, another provision, people really thinking about how can we make it work this time round. Now, all that said, I want to be the first to acknowledge that this is not a layup. So on this slide, just kind of a number of the operational challenges that are kind of popping to the top if we're going to make this work. So I'm just going to move left to right really, really quickly. The first is member opt-in. I actually don't think it's going to be that big a challenge to get a large share of members to say yes to getting their new plan to be able to get their data from their old plan. I think the bigger challenge actually is the technology. We actually have to be able to educate the members about this, be sure they're aware of it. When they say yes, we actually have to document this and get this all into the system so we can reach out to the old plan. Which brings me to the second challenge, which is probably the biggest challenge just from an operational standpoint. And there is no such thing in the US as a universal patient ID. So the new plan has to work with the old plan to figure out that John Smith and Johnny Smith and Jay Smith are all the same person. so they can actually request the records from the same person. They have to match that up. And so there's some significant work there to be done. The final one has to do with dual eligibles. So the information is supposed to continue exchanging on a quarterly basis. I'm going to set that aside because our focus today is really on what happens when a person moves from one plan to another. So these are the operational challenges. And if you saw kind of the title, remember our title is not about getting to compliance. It's about getting to impact. And so as you start to work with plans, one thing you learn very, very quickly is it's not just about getting the information. It's about getting the information in a way that can be utilized. So if you haven't done it, I encourage you to spend maybe 10 to 15 minutes with a care manager at a plan and understand what their day-to-day existence is like. Because what you're going to learn very, very quickly is less is more. They don't have time to plow through unstructured data and look at all this information and distill. They need to really, really quickly understand what are the key points where intervention is needed, and we can really, really help if the data that comes in, we've thought about how are we going to actually get it parsed, get it harmonized, get it normalized, so it can feed into the dashboards that our care managers can use. So for me, actually, this is the larger challenge if you're going to get to impact. So I just encourage everybody to really think about, hey, it's not just the operational challenges. We want to get more than just a pile of data that's not usable. We want to be sure that we're set up to actually harvest value from that data. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Karuna, who's going to talk about some of the experiences and the efforts underway at the Blues Plans as well as Da Vinci.
Thanks, Stephen. And I think Jess, you're going to go first, and then I'll hop in.
Oh,
yes.
Sorry.
No, it's good.
I'm going to really turn it over to my colleague at InterSystems to talk about the same thing.
Hi, everyone. If we can advance to the next slide. Okay, so going off of Stephen's conversations around things that we should be considering as we look into the payer-to-payer exchange, not just for regulatory compliance, but really to take advantage of what the API has to offer. Our left side here, you guys already know, the ins and outs of the regulation, so we won't go into the details of that. But some things you can consider, and we'll put the deck somewhere because I think some of this text is small. But first and foremost, we have to think about methods of capturing information from members. We talked about consent. We've talked about gathering coverage information. Doing that through the member portal is something that most folks are looking towards. But we need to have some kind of strategy in mind for being able to capture that information and do it in a way that's scalable. Also, some considerations, as Stephen mentioned, this concept of being able to go out and query all this information in almost like a bulk fashion or on some kind of interval process. The idea is to make that as seamless as possible. And with bulk fire being a part of the payer-to-payer exchange, there's a really good opportunity to reduce the burden on the health plan side and take advantage of that. So, for instance, you may want to consider grouping members by prior health plan and having individual kind of requests going out so that you can take advantage of that bulk fire aspect. So other pieces to keep in mind is, triggering mechanisms. Can we put this into into existing pipelines and patterns that you have in place to automate that process during, for instance, open season, as Stephen mentioned, so that this is just part of your workflow of onboarding new members. And then one other thing I'll just mention, like I said, there's a lot on here. Part of the payer-to-payer exchange, and I'll go into this more in my next slide, is really all around being able to get that information from, if you're the requesting health plan, getting that from that prior health plan and being able to continue that that care based on what that prior health plan knows about the member. And so part of that is kind of incorporating that into your own understanding of who that member is. And it kind of, and I don't mean to, I'll be talking about this actually tomorrow at our own booth, but it kind of implies growing out a longitudinal member record of sorts, right? Because I'm always kind of grabbing additional information from these external health plans, but I'm combining that with the information that I already know about that member. And from a regulatory standpoint, I need to be able to share that information from the Access API standpoint, but there's also a ton of value that I can drive off of getting that information from these APIs. So if you go to the next slide, Stephen, what we really want to impress on everybody is this idea that there's a lot of value in being able to take that information, harmonize it, normalize it, and put it into a structure that is used not only from an API perspective, but to drive any number of different initiatives, for instance, around value-based care. So being able to do things like risk adjustment, closing gaps in care. There's kind of the possibilities are endless, but it all starts from actually making usefulness with that data. If we're not curating that information, if we're just kind of dumping it, which might be our initial thought to check the box, we're really losing out on additional value that we can get from taking advantage of these APIs. So we're strongly encouraging folks as they look at taking advantage of the payer-to-payer exchange to think about, what's that information look like when I get it from these other health plans, and how can I actually make it useful within my own organization? And so now I'll turn it over to Karuna.
Thank you, Jess. And so Stephen and Jess pointed out a lot of things that payers are feeling right now as we're actively working towards payer-to-payer. There's a ton of opportunity with payer-to-payer, similar to prior authorization, and maybe doesn't get as much acknowledgement. But as I mentioned, it really has the opportunity to create that backbone for the longitudinal health record that payers are really invested in creating to be able to deliver the care services that we do on a daily basis. So what we're seeing today are payers are working on enhancing their processes. As Stephen mentioned, payer-to-payer was attempted a few years back, and we've been doing a lot of work to get the standard up to par to meet the needs of the business, of the payer's business. So we're seeing a lot of work being done to actually integrate the new processes. Payers do have legacy processes to acquire data, but of course it's not standardized or consistent. So some things that payers are doing today, they are kind of identifying their implementation questions. We heard a lot about bulk fire already. Things like what happens if the member one of the members doesn't match properly in that bulk fire request? Does that need to be rejected entirely? So really nuanced implementation questions that really boil down to some of their business processes in the end of the day. There's also the great news that folks are using the Da Vinci Guides. I think that was different than a few years back. So we are seeing that payers are bought into the Da Vinci Guides and are actively improving them. That being said, the nature of the regulation as well as the standards is that it shows what's possible and not necessarily is prescriptive. So that being said, payers are spending a lot of time right now navigating the expectations. So we heard about consent and opt-in. How are those processes going to be consistent across payers? How will that information be captured? The payers are very focused on understanding what the expectation is for structured versus unstructured data. How much are they going to be expected to be sharing when it comes to unstructured data? There's a 1-week rule for allowing members to opt in to that payer-to-payer data exchange, but how is that going to be actually enforced? And then there's things at the industry national level, like the endpoint directories. How are payers going to actually find each other to be able to request that data? So there is a lot of work being done to navigate these expectations, create convergence in the industry, and kind of understand what the consumer preference really will be in the end of the day. So payers are really excited about the opportunities to actually essentially build trust with the patient. If we're able to give meaningful care alerts and care interventions, and we have some justification and background for why that alert is being sent, there's some actual transparency and trust that can be built with the patient. And that's really the big opportunity here with payer-to-payer, and what payers are envisioning is that essentially that longitudinal health record will be made available to external applications. So you can have a startup come in and actually be able to pull that data and create the experience that you're seeking. And payers are also working towards that as well. So as Stephen and Jess mentioned, huge opportunity for payer-to-payer, really foundational asset here that CMS has included in the regulation that we're working towards. With the next slide, wanted to share a little bit about another group in the industry called the Sequoia Project. So for those of you that are not familiar, the Sequoia Project is the... thank you. The Sequoia Project is the recognized coordinating entity for TEFCA, and TEFCA is an initiative by ASTP to create a national highway of interoperability. So with the Sequoia group, what they've done is created a payer-to-payer work group. So they're invested in getting that payer adoption. We know providers are familiar with doing provider-to-provider exchanges. So what can we learn for the payer-to-payer purposes? So what the group is focused on is actually developing some of these actionable governance best practices, and you can see on the slide kind of what they're focused on. And so they actually have white papers and room for feedback from the public. I think they're focused on consent right now. But some of these really core competencies that we're going to need to figure out to be able to achieve payer-to-payer at scale. So this is a paid participation work group, but what they do is they share their insights and they bring in the rest of the industry. So I wanted to let you know on the next slide, Stephen, about an initiative called Trebuchet. So Trebuchet is a project under Da Vinci. Da Vinci is an HL7 accelerator focused on payer and provider use cases when it comes to interoperability. So at the upcoming Trebuchet meeting, we are actually having the Sequoia project come and present to us about what they are working on. These meetings are open to everybody. Highly recommend that you participate. They're bi-weekly meetings. And what Trebuchet allows is implementers to actually come through, learn about what folks like the Sequoia project are actually doing to create these alignments and these best practices, test them out, provide feedback, and then see that feedback be integrated into the standard and into the implementation requirements. So a lot of work being done to address the opportunity that Jess and Stephen discussed, and welcome you all to get involved and join us as well, because eventually we'll all be able to benefit from the payer-to-payer work that's being done today. Thank you all for joining.
So I don't know if anybody has any questions. We're going to be hanging out for a couple of minutes. But anybody want to be a brave soul and ask a general question, or would you prefer to just come up and ask us one off?
You're at the HL7 booth, so this is where HL7 comes in. And the red box is down there. This is I'll use my voice.
I hear you know a few things about Tefka.
I've read about it for the two different product areas that have implementation guides for the IPS. Now, most of the activity and most of our conversation today is going to focus on the right, the IPS fire notification guide. That's the one that we're always in traction for adoption. In addition to HL7, though, we have other standards of organizations that we have to. So in the blue box, you can see that both guides, the CDA and the fire Snowman. Snowman International has made an incredible contribution to the IPS. They have what's called Snowman IPS terminology. It's a sub-ontology of all Snowman. So it's not just a list of codes. It's actually taking all those relationships to make that available as a free creative commons license that you can use worldwide to support the IPS. Now,
It's not an aspect of. Got it. So, yeah. So I just want to underscore a couple of things that were shared. So one, that you can actually join some Sequoia meetings without being a member, and two, you don't have to be participating in Trebuchet or Sequoia or any of those things to be pushing on payer-to-payer. Just remember, when you go back to the rule is providing kind of enough guardrails to get going, and then it's really up to you in terms of how do you explore that. I'll tell you, at InterSystems, and I think I speak for the Blues as well, we do really encourage you to get involved in this stuff, because the ultimate challenge here is not doing it, one-off. It's enabling one plan to communicate with all plans. So we're all striving for that many to many, and the more we can have some even stricter guardrails in place, and I don't mean to contain you, I mean to enable you, right? It's really, really hard to drive if there's no map and there's no guardrails. It's really, really helpful, right? You can go to any state in America, any state in the world, and there's certain norms that make it really, really easy to drive. That's what we're trying to do here. Use the catalyst that was provided by 0057 to really enable, and I want to go back to where we started, that like kind of like golden window, right? When a member moves, can we stop all the care gaps there by pulling forward the information from their history and arming the care managers with that? So, I mean, just think about prescriptions. That's a biggie. Can we stop having prescriptions drop for a month or two when somebody comes over as we're going through all this administrative work at the plan to learn about our new member? Any other questions? Comments? That was very helpful. Thank you.